Management and Executive Editor of Print and Media, welcome all of you to yet another episode of the DynamicCIO. Now, COVID-19 has sharpened the understanding that the climate change could upend the financial system. Digital transformation is particularly urgent for small businesses, which are basically the engine of most economies. The pandemic has accelerated the client's digital expectations and the need for technology investment. Now, enough and more has been spoken and heard on the pandemic and the need of digitization, the new normal, etc. The pandemic has also exposed how unprepared many institutions were for one of the most global challenges in the generation. And yet, it has also catalyzed a wartime footing of speed and ingenuity in response. Now, we must bring those qualities to how we shape the post-pandemic global financial system. Now, unlike in 2008, the financial system has responded well. Financial firms have been resilient. They've not amplified their risk. They work with policymakers to take this reverse emergency lending. There have been standout examples of firms which have innovated very swiftly. Now, to talk about emergence of new financial paradigm in the post-pandemic world, I have with me today Mr. Conrad D'Souza, member of the Executive Management and Chief Investor Relations Officer at HDFC. Little about it. This gentleman is a mentor for me and on the board of HDFC Investments Limited India, HDFC Education and Development Services, HDFC Holdings, HDFC Sales, Chalet Hotels, Cool Sports, Chairman of AFPI, Housing Development Finance Corporation Maldives, Director on the Nation's Trust Bank Sri Lanka, core faculty at Frankfurt School of Finance and Management, faculty at Housing Finance Summer Academy, Chairman Audit Committee, member of the Asset Liability Management Committee, Allotment Committee, Equity Shares and Risk Management Committee of the Corporation, consultant to the UNDP and IFC, and personally a spokesperson at HAR. Let's welcome Conrad D'Souza. Welcome, Conrad.
Thank you, Smruti, and that was a long introduction and probably not required.
So, I got to without much ado, let me jump straight into the Q&A, As I said in my introduction for you, you're a sportsman at heart, and you have, after introduction and after knowing you for such a long time, you have finance in your veins. So I would want to hear with you about your journey so far, and I'm sure there are much more milestones that have been added apart from what I introduced to you.
So, okay, first of all, thanks for having me on this chat. And yes, I did play hockey at the national level, but at 21, I had to make a career choice. In those days, sport did not have the kind of money that you see today, and therefore I gave up active sport, although I continue to be in touch with the game. And today, in my spare time, I do follow a lot of sport, and travel is a form of R&R. I began my, academic career post my sports background by doing an MBA, interestingly, in marketing. And you said finance is in my veins. Yes, I guess, although I did an MBA in marketing, probably the financial acumen did stand out, and it did not realize at that stage that finance would be my domain for the rest of my career. And when I was mid-career, I also had an opportunity to study at the senior executive program at the London Business School, which was a wonderful mid-career opportunity to strengthen both strategy and leadership skills. So I think, from a career perspective, yes, that's the academic background. But over the last so many years of my working life, I have been engaged in so many different projects, and each one has been a learning experience. So whilst it's difficult to pinpoint any specific one, I think every time you take on something new, it is a challenge, and when you achieve it, it's a great deal of satisfaction. So that's been the kind of milestones, and interestingly, I was able to do whatever I've done in one single company, which has been probably as big a milestone as any.
Yeah, 37 years in HDFC, right?
Yeah, that's right.
As I said, in the introduction, you had multiple hats that you don't in your professional career. Your roles, you have dealt with multiple roles, and complex situations I'm sure would have arrived, in these long years. How do you balance all of this? Do you have any secret sauce, secret recipe for all this multitasking?
Well, I think there is no secret formula. It's just how you kind of focus on what you're doing and try to do it to the best of your ability. So, but I've really kept a certain key mantras in mind whilst working on any project, any assignment. I think the first one is just keep it simple. And the more simple you keep it, the easier it is to face the challenges. Secondly, you need to apply common sense to every situation. Business is all about relationships. And therefore, in a professional journey, you need to understand roles and responsibilities across different stakeholders. It's only then that you're able to appreciate what's happening on the other side of the table. And this process or this learning process is continuous. It does not end. Another aspect which is very critical when you engage in different activities is the fact that you should be able to empathize with what's happening around you. It helps you understand and play different roles as the need arises. Very often there's a debate on whether you need to be a specialist or a generalist. And whilst there is always a role for a specialist, I think as you go ahead in life, every specialist also has to be a generalist. Unless you have a holistic view of things, it is very difficult for you to adapt. And especially now, in an ever-changing, or as we call it now, a VUCA world. So I would say hard work is not negotiable. But what is most important, if you have to multitask, if you have to do different activities, is how do you manage your time management, and then ultimately teamwork. Because you will realize that as you go higher and higher, there are a lot of things that you need to do. But as they always say, management is managing men to a T. And therefore, if you can manage your team and work well with a team, I think they take a lot of load off you, and it gives you an ability to take on more responsibilities. And that's the way you would multitask. If you try to do everything yourself, then you're going to collapse.
So many key takeaways from just one answer of yours. You might have, keep it simple, apply common sense, focus on relationships, continuously learning process, be empathetic, have a holistic view, and I love what you said. Hard work is not negotiable. I've known you for at least 3 to 4 years, or maybe more than that, and I agree with what you say, and that's one big learning that I have for you. Team management, time management. You have given so many key takeaways to all my community, only with one answer of yours. So I know it really says about how do you actually manage all of this by keeping it very simple, very simplistic, and very focused. And that's how you are, as I know, as a person. So thank you for this answer of yours.
Welcome.
So as I said, you've spent 37 years with HDFC and a part of the executive management and on board of various companies. Simple question: what are your key learnings?
I think, when you go back, you sometimes kind of try to figure out what happened along the way and why did it happen. And really, when I took out my first job at HDFC, I had no clue what I was heading into. HDFC then was a startup, and for all practical purposes, in the office, we had a startup culture. It was the early 80s. We had a young team. People were very flexible and very eager to learn. And one of the key messages we got that this whole organization is about learning by doing. Now, obviously, when you say learning by doing, you're doing things, but you may not always get it right all the time. So we were encouraged to try out things. We were encouraged to make mistakes. But there was one very key message that when you make mistakes, please don't repeat them. And I think that's something which has stuck on right through our life. Secondly, what we were doing was something very simple. The home is the most basic need of a household, and we were satisfying that need. And I guess my initial experience of working in the lending operations at the front line, in a sense, shaped my career because it exposed me to customers of all walks of life. Interestingly, irrespective of background, financial or social status, a customer's attitude and approach towards owning a home was the same. Whether you were at the top of the rung of a corporate or you were at the lowest level of employment, for everyone that home was sacred and everyone worked towards buying that home, and that was a big achievement for the family as a whole. And what we also learned during this stage is that, and especially given that retail financial services was non-existent at that point in time, is that pricing is not going to drive business. It is largely customer service which will get you the business, and most importantly, the trust of your customer. And we worked very hard on that. We had to compete with people, with banks which were well settled in the business. We had to compete with foreign banks, but I think customer service and trust is what made this organization what it is today. Thereafter, 1991 was a big turnaround for the entire country. It was the year in which we began the financial sector liberalization. And for me, it was being in the right place at the right time. I got an opportunity to work on the HDFC Bank project, which was then a marquee project. I'm still not sure why I was chosen to do it, because I knew nothing about banking. But I think those couple of years, or maybe 3 years that I worked on that project, including putting together the business plan, was a lifetime of experience for a fledgling career. After that, I got an opportunity to work on the first finance company being set up for infrastructure, IDFC. And there was a team which was put together by the government and the central bank, which included, interestingly, future CEOs of banks and corporates. It included a future governor of the central bank. And it was a wonderful experience, not just learning about the infrastructure space, but also learning the financing of infrastructure, how it is done globally. And more than that, learning people skills from various team members who were obviously well versed in their respective businesses. And I would say I learned more off the project, just talking one-on-one with people. We had people from banking backgrounds, people from rating backgrounds. There were people from multilateral agencies, and I learned so much about the broader financial sector rather than just infrastructure. And today, when I sit on boards, it's nice to say I'm a board member, and therefore my job is to share my knowledge. But I think even today, when I sit on boards, and as you mentioned earlier, a few of them are in developing economies, I think it's a great learning opportunity for me, and to understand what's happening in different countries, share your knowledge for sure, but also learn from different economies and cultures. And I don't think it's anything better than when you work with housing finance companies in emerging and developing economies, where you learn that there are so many things that they do because they have started much later that we can learn out of them. And I think unless you go with that attitude, you're going to stop learning. So even being a board member does not mean you've reached the end of your career where now it's only time to give. I think there's enough of stuff to even learn, no matter how small the company is.
No, now the new normal, when I speak to a lot of CXOs and whoever I speak to, all talk about customer experience. I love the fact where you spoke about trust. How important? Nobody's talking about that, but I do agree as being on the other side of the road, that trust is a very important factor when you talk about the customer experience. You say name it as a customer service or however. Then you have the trust, and you very clearly focused as trust as one of your key learnings that you learned from HDFC. So I have a lot of key takeaways from this whole conversation. So great. So now let's get in something more topical. Okay. Now we've already had 2 lockdowns already there. The third one is anytime going to come in. That's what we've been hearing it. So and everything has been impacted because of this COVID and the pandemic. We all now. So how is the Indian financial sector placed, and what is your outlook?
Yeah, so you're right that we had a couple of I think the pandemic surprised all of us. None of us were prepared for it, and the first wave was severe in terms of economics. We had a complete shutdown. Production came to a standstill. There was economic distress. There was labor migration. Supply chains were disrupted. And when we got to the second lockdown, I think it was less of an economic impact. Across sectors, you would hear that people would say we did 60 to 70% of what we would normally do. And I think that was because we had a localized implementation of the lockdowns. The impact on lives was quite bad in the second lockdown, but lesser impact on livelihoods. Production was partially impacted, yes, but supply chains were not too disrupted. And even if we went to construction sites, there was activity going on. Now, the financial sector in the aftermath of the pandemic, I think there were three areas which one would say were the worrying factors for the sector. The first was obviously on liquidity. The second was on capital. And the third was on asset quality. If you look at the first couple of months of the pandemic or the first couple of months of the lockdown, last March and April, liquidity was a major issue. And whilst there was liquidity in the system, it was not channelizing to the right places. Interest rates had hit the roof. And for all practical purposes, the cash was lying in the banks. And there was a fear right around in terms of credit. In that situation, I think the RBI and the central government took some very important steps. The first one was that there were sharp rate cuts. There were a couple of rate cuts aggregating to 115 basis points on the repo rates, which were pretty sharp in a very short span of time. Secondly, the targeted long-term repo operations of the RBI ensured that liquidity went to sectors that required it. Thirdly, the banks that were sitting with excess cash but had the fear of credit were kind of encouraged to use these LTROs or the TLTROs to ensure that this money went to the right sectors. Now, this was one part, and it kind of brought liquidity back into the system, and interest rates came back to more normal levels. On the other side, there was the concern on asset quality. People were not sure of their jobs. Work from home is nice to say work from home, but for all practical purposes, people were not equipped to work from home at that point in time. And therefore, from an asset quality point of view, to absorb the shock, there was a moratorium announced. We had the first moratorium, which was 3 months. It was then extended to 6 months. The government identified certain sectors, and those sectors were provided the emergency credit line guarantee scheme to ensure that there is additional flexibility provided, additional liquidity provided to these sectors, and that additional amount was guaranteed by the government so that the lenders were able to commit this liquidity without worrying about the credit aspects or the asset quality aspects on this additional amount. We also had the one-time restructuring, which was offered for certain corporates and even retail customers who were impacted by the lockdown. I think all these aspects absorbed the shock of asset quality. And if you look at what's happened since then, whilst we would have never got to the pre-COVID levels on non-performing loans, we at least came close enough by the time we hit March 2021, despite all that happened in the whole year. And of course, there have been slippages, especially in the retail space, between March and June, thanks to the second lockdown. But if you look at what's happened thereafter, you have seen the collection efficiencies as put out by the agencies, the bounce rates as put out by the banking system. All these numbers are signifying that, yes, we are getting back to normalcy. And, I guess by the time in another month or so, when everyone announces results, you'll probably see a much better asset quality number compared to June. Now, the third part was capital. And on capital, you saw almost all banks and financial institutions raising capital at the peak of the pandemic. And I think that's a very important sign, was that despite everyone being at home, despite uncertainty on when things are going to open up, almost everyone was able to raise capital and raise capital successfully. So that reflected, one, in better capital ratios, ability to make provisions against asset quality issues, and also reflected the confidence in the sector. Now, I think the major change that's happened is with the limited mobility and disruptions, even during the second wave, there has been an acceleration in the digital activity that financial services have used to help tackle the services. Now, it's not that financial services did not have a digitalization program. It is just that it was not used as effectively as it is used today. Because I don't think people just woke up one fine day and they had a digital platform ready. It was there in the making, it was available, but not used. People were still used to walking into a branch, people were used to picking up a phone and talking, and they would rather do that rather than use the digital platforms. But that's all changed. And I think from the financial sector, from a longer term point of view, at the moment, the credit cycle is still not picked up. But as and when it does begin, I think the banks and the financial sector is well positioned from a capital perspective, from a liquidity perspective, to take on the next credit cycle with confidence.
I think the BFSI sector was never a non-digital sector. Digitalization always was pervasive in the BFSI sector. I think the pandemic just accelerated it 10x or 20x or 30x. Right, is what I understood from what I've spoken to people. Now getting into more of what you said, digital technologies, and a lot has been said about digital technologies and how the economy would have been, how the economy was close to getting collapsed. How do you see, the issue of business resiliency in the financial sector?
So you're right. When you said that the BFSI sector was, there was always a digitalization plan. It's just that it was not impacted. Just to give you a small example, if you have a branch of a bank close to you, and you could access your statement on the net, quite often you would walk into the branch, talk to your friend there, and get that printout and walk out. Now today that's almost not possible, and banks are just saying go to the digital platform. So maybe from a 50% utilization of that facility, today it's 100%. So the platforms are there. It's just that the utilization is far better given these circumstances. And I think the good part is the adaptation has been not just from the banking side, but also from the end user or the customer. So it's really a big leap in digitalization. Now, as far as digital technology are concerned, it is true and reflects the impact of the operational financial sector. When you compare the second wave compared to the first, there was a big impact because of digitalization. The pandemic, of course, induced a lot of these changes. It altered the way we work, it altered the way we live, and it also altered the way we conduct our businesses. And if you look at the last 1 year, I think there were two very, very common terms in the financial sector. One was work from home, something that most of us had never done. Never ever done. I think many people were just not connected. And even when we did get connected, there were a whole lot of issues on security and data privacy and all that kind of stuff. But we just moved on and tackled it as it came along. At the same time, digitalization became the focus areas. And some of the changes that have taken place during these last 18 months are going to stay far, far beyond the pandemic. The pandemic also exposed how unprepared many institutions were. But what's very interesting is that in this greatest of global challenges in generations, we saw almost everyone reacting, and it galvanized businesses to respond with utmost speed. And many banks, many institutions set up war rooms for speed of response. In fact, I can tell you from our personal experience and almost all experiences of people you talk to, no organization spoke to each other as much as they spoke during the pandemic. In fact, the easiest thing that has happened is communications, because on the click of a button, you could connect your entire organization. As compared to traveling and people not being available, not on their desk, things changed dramatically. And I think that was some of the learnings of the pandemic. Now, as far as the financial services segment is concerned, you are going to see a greater adoption of digital technologies. Institutions are looking at reinventing their business models. They're looking at leveraging on technology, which will make them resilient to uncertain situations and will help boost their revenues. So whilst they're going to incur a cost, they will also ensure that their revenues far outweigh the cost. So ultimately, no one is going to sacrifice profitability. And to bring in this differentiation, a lot of institutions are adopting new technology architectures, and these are being explored. Banks also are shifting focus on improving customer experience through hyper-personalization based on intuitive self-learning software. And this is being adopted across banks' financial system, and even, for example, consumer companies and other businesses. And this allows offerings in line with customer needs. However, one has to be careful, because one talks of digitalization, digital transformation is good, it's new age banking, but it does not come with the risk, without the risk of cybersecurity. And cybersecurity is a big, big risk that all organizations are going to face in the future. Given the fact that we spoke about trust, and financial institutions depend on customer trust, and to ensure that customer trust is of paramount importance, concerns like data security, malware attacks need to be resolved in the process of digital transformation, because it's nice to get a customer, onboard him and onto a digital platform. But if tomorrow there's something that goes wrong with his account, he's going to be very, very disappointed. And at the same time, from a banking point of view, if you look at what's happening in this digital world, I think the amount of anti-money laundering cases, the amount of terrorist funding which is routing through digital platforms, because banks don't have or are not equipped to handle KYC in a stronger manner. These are the kind of risks that institutions are facing and will have to take. So whilst digitalization is going to come with a lot of pros, there's also going to be a lot of cons. And therefore, it's not just one-way street where it's going to improve efficiencies, but there are also going to be an increase in compliance costs, which, if not undertaken at the right time, could be a huge damage to the business.
I think you answered, a lot of my questions, which I was going to ask you post this also. And as a governor of the financial sector, I had a lot of questions, but you answered mostly all of it. So I will want to take you to the last part of this. It's a very small, in the paucity of time. I will say one word. It's going to be like a rapid fire. I will say one word. You tell me what strikes you when I say that word. Anything. So for example, you take it. If you want to skip it, you can just say a pass. Easy? It's okay.
Let's try.
Yeah, Fintech.
So Fintech is required. It's going to be innovative. It's going to promise a better customer experience, but it's unlikely to be a disruptor. It has to work and coexist with banks.
Post-pandemic.
Yes, I'm talking of post-pandemic because...
no, I'm saying the word post-pandemic. I tell you post-pandemic.
Okay, sorry. So post-pandemic, I think we have to leverage of the relationships that we have or the experiences that we have during this pandemic, and I guess companies will become much more efficient in the way they operate. I don't think you're going to cut out travel, but it's going to be much more effective travel. You still need to meet people, but whether you will travel at the drop of a hat. There is another angle which we have not touched on, but there is ESG, which is becoming very important from an investor point of view. And every travel has a carbon impact, and therefore you will have people being much more conscious about travel. Plus, I think the stabilization of digital platforms, the fact that we're doing this interview sitting in two different locations without a fuss, I think all this is going to change the way we do business. It's going to be much more effective. But at the same time, I do not think you can discount the fact that you need to meet in person. So it will be a hybrid from an employee point of view. I guess many companies are exploring now whether you can have a hybrid model where a certain percentage of time you work from home and the rest of the time from office. So I think these are learnings which probably could have been discussed as an academic exercise, but we have experienced it, and probably learning from the experience of the last 2 years, you will see something far better.
So my next question was hybrid. My next word was hybrid, but you already answered it. Okay, so last, Indian economy.
Indian economy, if you looked at the first quarter numbers, we've had a good growth number, but that is obviously off a lower base. But if you look at RBI's projections, a 9.5% growth is what is targeted, which is among the higher growing economies. A lot of it will depend on the pace of vaccinations. I think as of now, roughly 25% of our population is fully vaccinated, 25% of the eligible population. And the faster that gets done, the more confidence in the economy, and that's going to help. As far as interest rates are concerned, RBI has been targeting a 4 to 6% CPI inflation band. The projections for this year are 5.7%, which is within its comfort zone. So one does not expect a run-up in interest rates. Most of the high-frequency indicators are in line with the pre-COVID, the pre-second wave kind of numbers, which means the economy is coming back after the second wave. And if you look at, as I mentioned earlier on the NPAs, collection efficiencies, bounce rates, one does expect some improvement. I guess in the near future, you will see increased capacity utilization, not much of capex, but once we cross that hurdle, you will see a capex cycle also, which will kick in. And the more immediate demand will be growth, which is aided by a revival in demand and also coupled with the infrastructure push that the government has undertaken in the recent past. So I'm quite hopeful for a big pickup in the economy as you go along.
That's good. That's something positive to hear. Thank you so much, Conrad, for this talk. A lot of positivity which has come out of the talk, and a lot of focus, obviously, on the post-pandemic. How the financial paradigm seems to be changing. Apart from that, I think that we had a lot of key takeaways from you as a person. In terms of learning, how learning is a process. We should continuously keep learning. Focus on relationships, trust. So thank you so much. This was such an amazingly, very positive conversation. A lot to know about you and the financial paradigm for the post-pandemic world. And on behalf of DynamicCIO, I would like to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Smruti, and all the best. Bye.
Thank you.